Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kate Faulkner, Associate Curator of Education for Public Programs at the Norton Museum of Art. Welcome to tonight's virtual talk, Oldenburg and von Bruggen, the Typewriter Eraser, a Favored Form. Tonight, Assistant Curator Rachel Gustafson will discuss new findings about the origins of Claes Oldenburg and Coosje van Bruggen's monumental sculpture, Typewriter Eraser, Scale X, and its development over 4 decades. The Norton is also celebrating a new book by Gustafson about the iconic work, which is due for release early March 2021. You may pre-order the publication, Oldenburg and von Bruggen, the Typewriter Eraser, a Favored Form, from the website, norton.org. While the museum's live lecture series is on hiatus, we are offering virtual Norton from Home talks, conversations, and more on most Thursday evenings at 6 o'clock. You can always find out more information about all of our upcoming Norton from Home programming at norton.org. Also, please remember that throughout tonight's program, you have the chance to submit your own questions and comments through the chat features available on YouTube and Facebook. And we will dedicate the last few minutes of the program to answering your questions. And now I'd like to welcome Rachel Gustafson.
Hi, Kate. Thank you so much for the warm welcome.
Of course.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this special preview into a new Norton publication that Kate so graciously introduced, and I have had the honor of working on. This book focuses on what has become just a beloved part of the Norton campus, and that is the sculpture Typewriter Eraser Scale X that stands right at our entrance. And so I'd like to start the slides this evening by just a little preview of what's to come. Here we see actually a cover of the book. And as I mentioned, I'm just one of the contributors to this forthcoming publication. But this book does look at one particular object in the Norton's collection, and that is the sculpture Typewriter Eraser Scale X by Claes Oldenburg and Coosje van Bruggen. And we see it here in the Samuel J. and Ronnie F. Heyman Plaza. It's part of the Norton's historic transformation under the direction of architect Lord Norman Foster. And in fact, all 4 of those individuals, we have Claes Oldenburg, Coosje van Bruggen, Ronnie Heyman, and Lord Foster contributed to making this sculpture here at the Norton. And because of that, they're all part of this publication. All their voices are included. But indeed, to be able to give insight into the book is to explain how this monumental sculpture arrived at this reflection pool. And before that, how it came into existence in the first place. The trouble when you're previewing a book is you definitely don't want to give too much away. I would much, much, much prefer for you to read for yourself. But that being said, there's so much told in the publication about this sculpture's developments that were only really briefly touched on. The nature of Oldenburg's art is complex. There are many interconnected forms and developments that find threads between one unexpected connection to another. So for tonight's talk, I thought I would give a brief overview of what the publication has in store for curious readers and Norton aficionados, and then look at what I found to be surprising tidbits of research that led me in a different direction, but still were quite fascinating. So here, as I mentioned, this sculpture is part was made in a collaboration, and I cannot stress that enough. And it's between Claes Oldenburg and his late wife Coosje van Bruggen. And here we see the two on the screen with a model of their iconic sculpture at the Walker Art Center, which is titled Spoon Bridge and Cherry. In the main essay, which I actually authored, I talk about that collaboration, but also the rich history that leads up to the Typewriter Eraser Scale X. You see, it was a combination of more than 50 years of developing the eraser's form that Oldenburg initiated back in 1968. But much like Oldenburg and van Bruggen, the sculpture's location at the Norton was the product of another creative collaboration and a generous exchange. And that happened between Norton trustee Ronnie Heyman, who I mentioned earlier, as well as architect Lord Norman Foster. We see them both here on the Norton's construction site way back in December 2017. And what you see beyond them is actually a model of Typewriter Eraser Scale X, so we could determine the placement. And a big part of that story is included in the book with reflections from both Mrs. Heyman and Lord Foster. So the reflections that are included essentially look at the placement. The placement is quite important when you're thinking about the whole Norton campus and the facade of the building. And so when the Norton received this sculpture as a gift, there was an exchange that happened between Heyman and Lord Foster to determine its elegant placement at the Norton's front entrance. And so what we have in this book is parts of that exchange, things that document how that unfolded. Here you see drawings from Lord Foster's own sketchbooks that depict how this sculpture could look in situ. And we also have photographs of the installation of this work. This is very much behind the scenes to see the many components that went into getting the sculpture here and installed with a complex mix of machinery, engineering, and of course, thoughtful design. And one of the most interesting revelations that I found when I was doing the research on this book came from Mrs. Heyman and her suggestion of considering a similar placement to that found at New York's Lincoln Center and the Henry Moore reclining figure sculpture that we see here in this picture. It's really quite interesting in the book to see how that all unfolded. But here I just wanted to show you two pictures that kind of show this juxtaposition and considering placement with this other iconic cultural center in mind. Another important part of this book that cannot be stressed enough is the voice of Oldenburg himself. We really wanted to be sure to capture that element. It was critical. And luckily for us, we had the support of the Oldenburg and Van Bruggen studio. They were an invaluable partner in this endeavor, and they offered archival photographs as well as supportive material to expand the book's reach. In my research, I came across a 1975 exhibition at the Walker Art Center. And actually what we see on screen relates to that exhibition. And what was interesting particularly was there were 6 themes that the exhibition looked at. And one of them was the typewriter eraser theme. So I had this critical bit of secondary research to uncover. The exhibition was titled Oldenburg's 6 Themes, and its supporting catalog was really a great starting point to see the multiple interpretations of the typewriter eraser in Oldenburg's oeuvre. So as I mentioned, this image is part and parcel to that exhibition because what we see on the screen here to the left is Oldenburg, but the masked fellow on the right is the eminent director of the Walker Museum, Martin Friedman. And in the exhibition's catalog, there's an interview between Oldenburg and Friedman. The exchange takes place again in 1975, which is really an important time in the development of the eraser theme. The interview from that catalog is reproduced in full here in this publication. And it really allows for an intimate reading of Oldenburg's feelings, the developments, and other associations with the eraser's form. So some of you who may be more familiar with the Norton's recent past, in 2019, we did organize an exhibition that shares the same name of this publication, Oldenburg and Van Bruggen, the Typewriter Eraser, a Favored Form. And we did that in part to help explain and tell the story of the monumental sculpture that was outside this new envisioned entrance to the museum. And again, this show opened in 2019, and we see images here on the screen of that installation. So at the time, we also had the participation and assistance of the Oldenburg and Van Bruggen studio, and they offered to lend rarely seen works from their own collection that really helped show the visual evolution of the eraser's theme. We also located other works from private collections and public institutions, and all together they helped further examine the beginnings of what would lead to Typewriter Eraser Scale X. So from that exhibition came the inspiration for this publication. And this book includes large-scale reproductions of all the works on paper and sculptures that comprise that earlier show. And like the exhibition, the book explains a decent amount, I wouldn't even say decent, a quite detailed amount of how what you see on the left, the real thing, a typewriter eraser, which is today perhaps considered an obsolete office tool or a relic, and how it takes on a new life under the creative efforts of Oldenburg and later in his collaboration with Van Bruggen to when it's taken to the monumental scale. But for some viewers, even the notion of what the sculpture depicts could be confusing. It's 2021 now, last I checked, and it would be very hard for some of our younger viewers to make that connection between the small tool that you see in my hand on the left and the monumental sculpture that it becomes later on. And in 1971, Oldenburg wrote about this element to his works, this idea that time plays a role in how they are interpreted, and talks a little bit about what I would consider their woebegone nature. For when you consider an object, you must consider the time in which it would have been recognizable. And he said in 1971, "As time goes by and the things the sculptures represent vanish from daily use, their purely formal characteristics will be more evident. Time will undress them." And for me, that's really quite a critical description, and one that I see as we look forward to the future and even beyond as to how this sculpture will be interpreted. Now here we see another archival image of Oldenburg from earlier in his career. Many of you watching tonight would recognize Oldenburg well before his monumental large-scale sculptures like the one outside the Norton. But in reality, the typewriter eraser is not the only commonplace object Oldenburg depicts in his artworks. Some viewers may be well aware of Oldenburg's early explorations in pop art and avant-garde theater and performance. And here in this image, we see Oldenburg in his installation called The Store. So it was a studio space that he worked in and also performed, and he wanted it to operate like the five and dime shops that would have surrounded it at the time where it was on the Lower East Side of New York. It was an explosive time in New York City in the art scene, and Oldenburg wanted to sell his wire-formed plaster sculptures covered in this expressive enamel paint directly to a consumer. And so he set up the store, and these sculptures that he worked on represented staples from modern life. He made clothing, foodstuffs, and other items that Oldenburg would later describe as radiant commercial articles. And as Oldenburg's prolific career progressed, he continued to expand on the banal items from everyday life. You'll see examples of sculptures that take the form of clothespins on a monumental scale. You'll see large stuffed hamburgers that are the size of your dining room table, or cigarette butts made of bronze. And again, it would be a very interesting expanse of objects, but he'd also do it in an expanse of materials, and they were often provocative, and usually at an inflated scale. They were witty and radical, and they were depictions of familiar objects in new ways that the viewing public at the time wouldn't have been quite familiar with. It was very untraditional, and so he really broke a lot of molds, and because of that, he's very much seen as among the originators of pop art, and it really does constitute one of the defining elements of his career. So just a little bit of background for those of you who may have only been familiar with his art as the typewriter eraser outside the Norton. So now that we have some of that foundation laid out and you know what's in store a little bit in terms of the publication, and again, without trying to give too much away, I wanted to talk about tonight's presentation and expand beyond what the publication was able to touch on. I'm really thinking tonight maybe we can look at the nooks and crannies of the sculpture's history. I'm reminded of a documentary filmmaker, Ken Burns. He has written about his process and calls it a reductive process. He starts with all the information he can gather about, say, the Civil War, and then has to peel away to reduce the mountain of information into valleys. And I say this because the history of the typewriter eraser within Oldenburg's career is vast. It's so vast indeed that including every development and milestone would have made for a much longer publication. So tonight I will touch on some of the valleys that this book explores, but I will attempt to drive deeper into aspects that were too far afield for the book, but still fascinating to come across. So the first area we'll look at is the role of writing and print media. It was something I was expecting, but I didn't quite grasp the extent of until the book research was well underway. This is the first of 5 elements that piqued my interest as the research for this project progressed. But I should point out that of all the surprises, this section has the most to unpack. So we'll be going through a few developments here. So when Oldenburg was younger, he grew up in Chicago, in wartime Chicago. And his father was stationed as the city's Sweden, in the city as Sweden's consul general. The office for the consul general shared the same building as the Oldenburg family residence. The artist recalls spending many weekends as a child at his father's office, exploring the workplace treasures that would capture any young person's imagination. And these included typewriters and typewriter erasers. He reflected that he considered the typewriter eraser to be one of his, quote, best friends. And here we see Oldenburg with one of his self-sculptures. This is Soft Typewriter from 1963. It's made of sewn vinyl and it's filled with foam. But the written word, or the typewritten word, should I say, had a hold of Oldenburg. He went on to study English literature at Yale, and his first job out of college was an apprentice reporter. And later on, when the visual arts became Oldenburg's main focus, the typewriter and writing were still integral to his practice. So here we see on the screen Oldenburg at a stand-up makeshift desk. And what you see on the cover of this book from MoMA on the right-hand side shows his vintage typewriter eraser, which he did set up in his studio. He would set it up in a corner, and every now and then he'd take a break, go over to the typewriter and expel crazy thoughts, or so he wrote. And as you can tell by looking at this image, he had set up his studio by the mid-1950s in New York, but this typewriter was from the 1920s. So it would have been closer to the kind of typewriter that Oldenburg would have seen in his father's office. So with this emphasis on tools of writing and then being really integral to the way Oldenburg operated day to day, the eraser would have also made an impression as another office staple. Oldenburg's approach to an artist's sketchbook included collage elements, and he would often incorporate magazine advertisements into his notebook. What you see here is an advertisement from a 1956 Life magazine. This is an advertisement that you would see in the middle of it towards the back, but just to illustrate as an example of what becomes the first instance of the typewriter eraser theme in Oldenburg's exploration of it. And so this is not precisely the advertisement he would have used, but just to give you that background, looking at this example here. So this is the first visual representation of the typewriter eraser in Oldenburg's career. You see at the center of this composition a typewriter eraser, and that eraser would have been cut from a magazine advertisement. And so Oldenburg clipped it out, pasted it in what he called his note pages, and you'll see on the right-hand side included dimensions and a simple equation at the bottom, handwritten out, an equal sign, and then the word ear. We'll get into, if you can go back one slide, please, Bobby. Okay, so at the bottom, again, you'll see equal ear. We'll get into Oldenburg's equations a little bit later, but it's worth pointing out the source material was printed material. And so again, thinking about the written word, the printed word, I think this is all part of things that did surprise me. And in some ways, we can consider this work on the screen here a study or a plan for what will become the first sculptural depiction of the typewriter eraser, which again takes us back to the world of printed media, in particular, Esquire magazine. And so you see here on the left, the cover of Esquire, that's actually a photoshopped Andy Warhol within a Campbell's soup can. And Oldenburg had written a script, and in December of 1968, Esquire magazine had approached Oldenburg to make a contribution to a forthcoming edition of their magazine. And essentially what was decided upon was that he would write a script. And Oldenburg ultimately titled it the Typewriter Eraser, along with the descriptive heading that you see on the right-hand side, which is the first page of the printed piece, My Very Last Happening. Happenings were early examples of performance art, and Oldenburg was really one of the medium's forefathers. Now, Oldenburg's typewriter was published again in that May 1969 edition, and he described it as an anti-visual theater piece. Oldenburg had spent 3 weeks in an office on Madison Avenue testing out how the script would proceed, but again, it was never meant to be produced or never meant to be seen through as an actual happening, but rather a piece people would read. So again, we see that cover on the left and on the right, that first spread. But if you're looking at that first spread in black and white words, kind of on the left side of the page, you'll notice there are overlapping typewritten words. Now, those words were actually made with Oldenburg's old typewriter that I had shown earlier, and make up the kind of sounds that are often overheard in an office building, or as Oldenburg described the setting, an office of maximum desolation, austerely functional, and penny pinching. So quite the scene that he's setting here in the typewriter. On the second page of the spread, we have this excellent photograph that in the midground shows Oldenburg lying on the desk of that Madison Avenue office that I had mentioned. And in the foreground, what we see is an oversized typewriter eraser and pencil. So these were sculptures that Oldenburg made specifically for the purpose of testing out the script that, again, was never meant to be performed. But if it had, those objects would have been part of the performance that the audience would have participated in. So one of the, just to point out, one of the details that I love in this photo, again, this was something he was working on in December of 1968. You see beyond Oldenburg a secretary sitting at her desk, and then beyond that, there's actually a Christmas tree that's all lit up. So you can imagine any of our offices come any December, and the same decorations might particularly be up. So to me, that really just highlights a moment in time. And again, just highlighting here so you can see that sculpture, the first sculpture, the typewriter eraser that I mentioned. And again, here's another image just to show you kind of the rich colors that the photograph from Esquire didn't entirely capture here. And so again, we're still talking about printed media here in this section, but books particularly had a role to play when we consider the evolution of the typewriter eraser theme. Here, what we see is the dust jacket of a publication that came from the same year that the Esquire magazine piece was published, 1969. The book is titled Claes Oldenburg, Drawings and Prints. There are over 100 works on paper illustrated within, but not one of those pictures on the inside of the book depicts a typewriter eraser. Instead, Oldenburg chose to have it grace the cover. So when he was first developing what image could be on the dust jacket, he made a crayon and pencil drawing to depict an isolated eraser on a large sheet of paper. Now this, what you see on the screen, is actually a lithograph of that from that original drawing, which then becomes the book's dust jacket. But please notice, you'll see the eraser in this instance has a vertical orientation, and that was the initial way it was thought of for the dust jacket. But as we get into book design, Oldenburg works with the book's designer, Mark Ratliff, and decided to turn the orientation. And so what you see here, and you can see it here side by side, is the drawing gets rotated on it from a vertical to a horizontal. And now it's able to wrap the entire book in such a way that when you open the manuscript, you see the eraser take on a completely different orientation. So rather than a linear eraser, what you have is the object takes on 3 dimensions, the drawing takes on 3 dimensions. And Oldenburg was quite pleased with this and calls it his bent eraser. It's a concept that was then explored at length thereafter. And it's one of those rare circumstances where printed media then impacts the way he will design a 3-dimensional work. And just to illustrate that a bit more, you see in these sketches 1970 were drawn as concepts for a proposed large-scale sculpture that was slated actually for New York City. Now, believe it or not, for all the large-scale sculpture that we see throughout the world for Oldenburg that he made in collaboration with Van Bruggen, there's actually not one in New York City. There was a performance he did in New York City called Placid Civic Monument, where he worked with grave diggers to dig a grave in the middle of Central Park and then bury it, fill the hole up with nothing in it. And that is the only monument, so to speak, in New York City that Oldenburg was able to produce. But in 1970, he was given the opportunity to present what he calls his first permanent feasible monument. And he actually had the typewriter eraser slated as a theme. So what you see here on the right-hand side are sketches that are helping him develop that concept. The monumental work was slated to be installed in a commercial or office building courtyard that would have been located on West 57th Street across from the Art Students League. But actually, as I mentioned, that was never built. But the orientation of this bent shape really took hold, and it all stems from this book. And so again, this interpretation of how printed media impacted the evolution is something that was surprising. There's another book project that's worth mentioning in terms of how the Norton's own publication was designed. What you see on the screen is a spread of Claes Oldenburg Notes in Hand. Now, this is a handheld book that when it was sold in the 70s, the retail price was $2.95. So it was quite accessible for people to be able to browse through 50 pages of Oldenburg's own notebooks. So that first image that I showed you of the eraser cut out of the magazine clipping, for example, that was one of the note pages that was included in this book, along with what you see on the screen here. And so this is at the top of that double page spread on the right-hand side, you see a quick sketch of the typewriter eraser. And at the bottom, another quick sketch of a three-way plug, which was another theme Oldenburg explores at length. When he was writing this book, at the back, he does include details on each of his notebook pages that are included in this publication. And he talks about these two sketches and how they were considered to be used as elements within a catalog that was currently, at the time when Notes in Hand was being developed, in production from MoMA in New York. The museum at the time was mounting the artist's first retrospective in 1969. And this is the catalog here you'll see on the next slide. So the cover is a little hard to read here, but that's because they mimicked Oldenburg's soft sculpture when they were producing this book. It's actually made of vinyl and stuffed with a little bit of foam. And you can see just beyond it, just barely on the pink paper behind the cover, little sketches or drawings. And that's because the Notes in Hand version of the typewriter eraser and the three-way plug were being considered for inclusion in these end papers. But instead, the final product included sketches of cigarette butts, half-eaten good humor bars, a screw, and a few other iconic Oldenburgian kind of themes that he approached throughout his career. So the eraser and the three-way plug did not make the cut for the inclusion, and they were ultimately not selected. But the Norton saw an opportunity when we found that this rendering of the typewriter eraser had this proposed original placement as end papers. And what you'll see in our book is actually we worked with the studio and they agreed for us to use the same drawing that's seen at the top as our own end papers in the book. So we were able to see that idea through in this publication, which is really nice. And the book has a few other details that are worth mentioning when we think specifically about Oldenburg's drawings. If you were to purchase the book and take off its own dust jacket that has this great photograph of typewriter eraser scale X, what you'd find underneath it is what's depicted on the right-hand side. And that is another Oldenburg drawing. So you'll see actually in this example, on the left is another notebook page from 1969, where Oldenburg is merging the elements or components of a punching bag with the typewriter eraser. And much like the way the orientation of the eraser was flipped in drawings and prints, we flip the drawing here. So again, underneath is a surprise should you choose to indulge. So this brings us to the second section. So as I mentioned, the printed media and the written word had a lot of surprises for me to uncover. And so these next few sections will go a little bit more quicker because there's not as many threads. But this next section, this is not an eraser. It's an unlikely thread, and it has a relationship, believe it or not, back to writing and printed media. So when Claes Oldenburg Drawing and Prints was published, a limited edition was also released of that book. And within that limited edition, buyers got a bonus. They got another typewriter eraser lithograph. And here you see it on the screen. It was made in an edition of 100 at Gemini GEL. And it's compared, when you're thinking about the precision of the dust jacket drawing, that really changes the way the three-dimensional illustrations of the typewriter eraser evolve. This version of the typewriter eraser is much more gestural, and it really shows the artist's growing aptitude and ease with lithography and creating just a free-spirited eraser compared to that really precise version we saw earlier. Now, at the center of each of these 100 prints, Oldenburg wrote in pencil the word eraser. You'll see it right at the center of the bracket there. And it brought to mind for me something that Oldenburg had said at a 2013 lecture at the Walker Art Center. Luckily for me, it was recorded, and I watched the hour-long discussion that marked the occasion of the most recent traveling retrospective of Oldenburg's career that MoMA helped organize, called Claes Oldenburg the 60s. Now, during this talk, Oldenburg mentions the work of Belgian surrealist René Magritte, in particular, the 1929 painting, The Treachery of Images, which you see here on the screen. He said of Magritte, quote, "What I like about him is that he made the point very clear that what he was rendering was not the object, but a picture of the object or a drawing of the object." His famous, "This is not a pipe," which is written in French, is a beautiful painting. It means a lot to me because I am not an artist of found objects. I don't just locate something and don't touch it the way maybe Duchamp might have done. I like to change things, end quote. So when I saw this lithograph, those words came back to me. The word eraser being written in pencil is a witty turn, an eraser that could indeed erase its own credentials if it needed to, or its identity as Oldenburg wrote it in each print. It is a paradox between images and language and a thought-provoking juxtaposition that for me recalls The Treachery of Images and also Oldenburg's influence or how he said that painting impacted him. But it also reinforces Oldenburg's interest in form. He is, in his mind, not depicting an eraser, but using its form to create something new, something that time will undress. Now, the next section is possible because of the Norton's own archives. I worked with the Norton's former archivist, Marie Penny, to see if the Norton had ever previously exhibited any one of Oldenburg's typewriter erasers. I was looking at how many artworks considered this theme, and I thought, well, maybe, just maybe, at some point in our history, the typewriter eraser had made an appearance before the wonderful inclusion of it in our Plaza. And, believe it or not, it had. So this is a view of a work called Heroic Sculpture in the Form of a Bent Typewriter Eraser from 1970. It is actually one of the models that Oldenburg made when he developed that West 57th Street project I had mentioned earlier. Now, this work was part of an exhibition called the Frederick R. Weissman Collection, and it was installed at the Norton in 1988. And for the same exhibition, what we see here in this next image, way in the back in the center, is actually the first sculpture of the typewriter eraser. So that is the same eraser that you see here in the Esquire picture from before, if you remember. And so quite impressive that that very first iteration of the eraser in 3 dimensions was actually installed here at the Norton and is part of our history. Now, a decade later, in 1998, another typewriter eraser sculpture was on view in an exhibition simply titled Pop Art. Now, this sculpture is from an edition of 18, and it was made in 1970. Now, if we fast forward to 2019, when the show the most recent show of exhibitions of Oldenburg's typewriter erasers was shown at the Norton, we have the same sculpture here, the same sculpture from that edition of 18. So it's all part of the history of the typewriter eraser at the Norton. And in looking back, we can tell the history of the typewriter eraser scale X by looking at our own history. And lucky for us, Marie Penny, again, the archivist who used to work with the Norton, her excellent archival research will soon be on view in an exhibition titled Celebrating the Norton, 80 Years, because believe it or not, we've been around for 80 years, folks, which will open next Friday. So thank you, Marie, for helping me find those little bit of traces of typewriter eraser from Oldenburg in our distant, well, not so distant past. So the fourth elevation relates to typewriter eraser scale X and the meaning behind its title. So why scale X? Or was that a Roman numeral 10? Well, the answer, as in many Oldenburgian truths, was multi-layered. And it's probably the most surprising of them all. So what you see here on the screen is a sculpture that Oldenburg made called Geometric Mouse, scale X, red, from 1971. It was installed, as we see it here, in Newport, Rhode Island in 1974 as part of Momenta, Sculpture and Environment. The same year this work was made, Oldenburg had deemed the geometric mouse as a theme to be his deputy of scale, making different variations of the sculpture in a large range of scales, scale A, B, C, D, and X being the largest. So this drawing from 1971 kind of makes that clear. He almost has created a hierarchy of the scales. This is part of the Walker Art Center's collection. And again, the scales outlined with scale X being at the very, very top. Now the sizes for each of the scale of the geometric mouse are determined by the diameter of the ear of the mouse. So the circular disc that's at the top. Following this practice, let's go back and consider that very first notebook page. At the bottom, what is written? Equals ear, right? And so for me, I was starting to make a connection. I looked at the diameter of the eraser's wheel, and wouldn't you know it, scale X, geometric mouse, the diameter of the ear is 9 feet, and it's the same diameter of the wheel of the eraser in our sculpture. When we look back again at that first notebook page, I think his notation really comes into focus. And while there are connections for me that I see between the eraser theme and sound or the auditory senses, where ear, that equation could relate, and the book really goes into this a little bit more. But I think what's at play does relate to this scaling system, this idea of the geometric mouse being the deputy of scale, and how the diameter of both these discs, reoccurring shapes throughout Oldenburg's career, relate to one another. And the coincidence is too important not to get into. And now this is the final element that was surprising to me. And it comes in the form of a personal correspondence. I was lucky enough to go to the National Gallery of Art way before the pandemic on a courier trip. And while I was there, I was able to do some research in their object files. Now, if I hadn't mentioned this previously, the National Gallery of Art also owns Typewriter Eraser Scale X. That sculpture is made in an edition of 4. So the Norton's is edition 1 of 4. And the National Gallery, if you were to visit DC and go to their sculpture garden, they have edition 2 of 4. So I was in their object files doing a little bit of digging, and what I came across was this little bit of mail. Now it's very hard to read. It's not a very good scan, but what you see on the top left side on this Post-it is a typed written note, and it's from Oldenburg and Van Bruggen. And it followed their visit to the National Gallery after they came to help with the installation of their edition of Typewriter Eraser Scale X. And what is written there, I typed out at the bottom. You'll see thanks for the great time in DC, and it's signed with both of their names. And so I wanted to see, well, what is this sculpture? What is this comic all about? And in doing other listening of different lectures from more recent history, I came across a lecture that Oldenburg gave at the Hirshhorn Museum in 2014. And he actually mentions this comic. And I was really pleased to have known that when doing my research a year or two before, actually when I was still working on the exhibition, that the comic that he was talking about in that lecture was part of the research I was able to pull. So I did reproduce it here so you can see the sentiment. But what is true is this idea, I mean, it is a bit of social commentary, but it's obviously one that resonated with Oldenburg for him to have to put this in an envelope and mail it to the good folks at the National Gallery, was exactly what he was talking about in 1971. You have this little girl talking with her mom about a typewriter eraser when she doesn't really even know what a typewriter is. And so this idea of the passage of time. And so when he said in 1971 that as time goes by, and things that the sculpture represent will vanish from daily use, their purely formal characteristics will be more evident. Time will undress them. And so this comic really brings that into focus for me, and this idea that the eraser is freed of its identity and really its form takes the fore, which brings me to kind of our final realization, which is a realization that I think can only happen in person when you visit this sculpture. When you walk around the front plaza at certain times of day, at certain times of year, you get completely different experiences. No two experiences are the same. The sun may shift, the wind might pick up the water in the pool and change the reflections that bounce off the metal roofline above. And all these things together is something that gets to be experienced multiple times if you were to visit the Norton, and particularly how it's installed here in our plaza in this reflection pool. And it really takes me back to another example, another watercolor that Oldenburg produced in 1970. It's actually from the Whitney Museum's collection, where we see the eraser in all its possibilities, all its multiplicities, the different shapes and orientations it could have taken along the way. And really kind of, it takes on almost a figural quality. It almost seems that the erasers are dancing. And when you look at those pictures of the eraser in our plaza, I get the same sense of momentum, the same sense of gesture. So today, as generations continue to age and new generations come up, I think questions about the sculpture subject will probably continue to percolate. People might continue to ask, well, what is a typewriter? What is a typewriter eraser? But its form is what's central here, and particularly in this installation at the Norton. And as new audiences come to fall in love with the sculpture and the collection that the Norton has within its walls, the identity of the typewriter eraser scale axe has really converged with the Norton's own identity. And I hope that this book really helps tell the story a bit further and helps continue to capture the community's hearts as this sculpture becomes an icon for the area. And it's really been an honor to preview the book this evening. Again, my many thanks to Mrs. Ronnie Heyman, Lord Foster, and of course, Claes Oldenburg and the Oldenburg Van Bruggen studio for their support throughout this process. I also would be completely amiss not to thank Cheryl Brutvan for her continued support as a director of curatorial affairs for this project, Lorraine Bond for her keen design, and my dear editor, Wilson McBee, for his sharp editing skills. So now Kate's gonna come back and join me and see if we have any questions that I can answer.
Hey, Rachel, I'm back.
Hi, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really fascinating and complex look at this artist, and it was such a thorough exploration and really like wonderfully way of illustrating the evolution of that sculpture. So I appreciate this, and it's been such a great learning experience for me.
Thank you.
I'm looking, we have a lot of comments. I actually have a couple of questions. You mentioned that, you know, books and printed media and the written word were so important in the kind of like the impetus for that beginning of the typewriter eraser. And I wondered, do we know if any of his other writings are published, or did he publish additional books, or are there places that we could see?
Oh yeah.
writings. Yeah.
Absolutely. The MoMA worked with his daughter, Martha Oldenburg, to produce a book called Writing on the Side. I actually illustrated the cover of the book earlier in the presentation. And so Oldenburg was really a prolific writer. He kept detailed diaries, not only of who he saw every day and sometimes even what he ate, or his shopping list, and also bigger contextual ideas about things he was thinking about items he wanted to make as sculptures for the store, about script notes for different happenings. So if you were interested in reading more about his own writing, that is an excellent source to start with. And he also wrote a fair amount of poetry. And of course, there is his very well-known statement, "I am for an art," which talks about all the different versions of perhaps raw art that he is for, out of the gallery system, out of the museum system. And it's really a very poetic way to approach art. And actually that statement, I'm glad you brought that up, is included in part in the book, and it's hidden somewhere like some of the other things I talked about. So you'll have to get the book and see for yourself.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you. And I also wondered, you mentioned that Magritte was one of his influences and Duchamp. Do we know what other artists that he was really kind of drawn to or strongly influenced his kind of evolution?
Sure. Well, I should say that he tried to, there were elements that he thought were related to Duchamp, but he really tried to distance himself from Duchamp because he didn't see himself as an artist of found objects or just taking things and putting them directly in the composition, perhaps like Robert Rauschenberg would have done with his Combine paintings, for example. So Oldenburg really felt like he was doing a different direction. And so while Duchamp was something that he kept in mind, it wasn't necessarily the utmost influence. An artist that he really does write a lot about is Dubuffet and his raw style of art. And that was really influential to the early part of Oldenburg's career. And there's also the psychoanalytic writings that were really important to Oldenburg and something he kept going back to. He also really enjoyed the writings of Walt Whitman, but back to psychoanalysis, Freud was very important as well as Freud's pupil cycle. So there were a few perhaps literary influences as well, not just the visual arts.
Oh, interesting. Well, thank you so much.
Well, I'm so pleased again to have presented this publication tonight. So thank you all for tuning in, and I'll let Kate sign off. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining us again tonight. Please remember that Norton from Home virtual talks and conversations currently take place on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. And next Thursday, February 4th, please join us here for a discussion with Marie Penny, Director of Archives at the Preservation Foundation of Palm Beach, who will present highlights from the upcoming exhibition, which Rachel mentioned during her presentation, entitled Celebrating the Norton 80 Years, and that will be opening February 5th. So we certainly hope you will join us for that. Until then, thank you and have a great evening.